At 1400 hours on a foggy afternoon in July 1942, the city of Oakland held its breath. Mrs. Beatrice Lawson didn't hear the engines at first. She was 42 years old, a woman who'd buried one husband already and sent another son to the Navy just 3 weeks prior. She stood in her backyard with a wicker basket balanced on her hip, pulling white sheets from the clothesline. The cotton was warm from the California sun. The air smelled like eucalyptus and salt from the bay. Then the ground began to hum. It started low, deep in the earth, like distant thunder rolling across the valley. The vibration climbed through her shoes and into her bones. The windows in her kitchen rattled in their frames. A coffee cup fell from the counter inside and shattered on linoleum. Mrs. Lawson looked up. The shadow fell over her garden like the hand of God. A massive, twin-engine fighter aircraft screamed over her roofline at less than 50 feet. The wash from its propellers hit her like a physical wall. Wind tore the sheets from her hands. Pillowcases whipped into the air. White laundry scattered across the dirt like surrender flags on a battlefield. The roar of the engines was so loud it erased thought. Mrs. Lawson stumbled backward, clutching the fence post, her heart hammering against her ribs. The plane didn't pull up. It banked hard to the left. Silver wings flashed in the sun. The twin booms of the P-38 Lightning gleamed like polished chrome. The aircraft turned toward the Golden Gate Bridge and dove. Mrs. Lawson watched, mouth open, as the fighter dropped below the horizon line and disappeared toward the bay. Inside the cockpit, Second Lieutenant Dalton Bridger was grinning like a kid who'd just stolen his father's truck. He was 21 years old. He had a round face that made him look 17. His hands were calloused from farm work back in Wisconsin, hands that had driven tractors through muddy fields and milked cows before sunrise. Those same hands now gripped the control yoke of the most advanced interceptor in the American arsenal, and he was treating it like a joyride. The Golden Gate Bridge rose ahead of him, orange towers piercing the fog. Dalton pushed the nose down. The altimeter unwound. 500 feet, 300, 100. The bridge deck rushed toward him. He could see cars. He could see people walking. He could see their faces turning upward, eyes wide with terror. At the last possible second, Dalton pulled back on the yoke. The P-38 roared beneath the bridge span, threading the gap between the water and the roadway with less than 30 feet of clearance. The twin Allison engines screamed. The propellers churned the air into a hurricane. Wind buffeted the bridge deck. Hats flew off heads. A woman dropped her purse. A man threw himself flat on the concrete. Dalton climbed hard, pulling 7 Gs, the force crushing him into his seat. His vision tunneled. Blood drained from his head. But he kept pulling. The lightning clawed skyward, engines howling, and shot up over the suspension cables like a rocket. He leveled off at 2,000 feet, waggled his wings at the bridge below, and turned back toward Oakland. He was laughing. He didn't see the military police cars waiting on the tarmac at Hamilton Field. He didn't see the base commander standing beside them, arms crossed, jaw set like granite. Dalton touched down smooth as butter, rolled to a stop, and killed the engines. The propellers spun down to silence. Only then did he notice the reception committee. The MPs didn't salute. They didn't speak. They just pointed toward the base headquarters and waited. Dalton climbed out of the cockpit, parachute slung over his shoulder, flight suit soaked with sweat. His ears were ringing from the engine noise. The walk to Colonel Augustus Blackwell's office felt like the longest mile of his life. Blackwell was 52 years old. He had flown biplanes in the First War, shot down 2 German Fokkers over France, and carried shrapnel in his left leg that ached when the weather changed. He had grey eyes that never blinked and a jaw that could crack walnuts. He chewed cigars, but never lit them. He ate second lieutenants for breakfast and didn't bother with salt. Dalton stood at attention in front of the desk. Blackwell didn't look up. He was reading a report. The pages were covered in complaints. The Bridge Authority wanted someone's head. The Oakland Police Department wanted charges filed. And Mrs. Beatrice Lawson, housewife, wanted someone to pay for her ruined laundry. Blackwell set the report down. He looked at Dalton for a long time. The silence in the room was heavier than the P-38. "You know what you did, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir." "You violated restricted airspace. You endangered civilian lives. You caused a public disturbance. You made the United States Army Air Corps look like a circus act." Blackwell's voice was flat, cold, surgical. "You have anything to say?" Dalton hesitated. Then, "The plane handled it, sir." Blackwell's expression didn't change. He picked up a pen. He wrote something on a piece of paper. He slid it across the desk. It was an address in Oakland. "That's her house," Blackwell said. "You're going to find Mrs. Lawson. You're going to apologize. And you're going to wash every single sheet you blew into the mud, by hand, with soap, until they're clean enough to put back on her line." Dalton stared at the paper. "Dismissed." Dalton saluted. Blackwell didn't return it. The interview was over. The other pilots found out within the hour. They were waiting for him in the barracks when he returned. 12 men, most of them older, all of them combat-bound. They were sitting on bunks, polishing boots, writing letters home. When Dalton walked in, the room went quiet. Then someone started to laugh. "Hey, Bing Bong!" A captain named Marsh, 28, already an ace with 6 kills in China. "Heard you got laundry duty." The room erupted. Men howled. They slapped their knees. They threw wadded-up socks at Dalton's head. "Bing Bong," the barnstormer. "Hey, Bridger, you gonna loop the Bay Bridge next?" "Maybe he'll strafe a grocery store." Dalton said nothing. He grabbed a bar of soap from his footlocker and walked out. Mrs. Lawson was waiting for him on her front porch. She was a small woman with grey hair, pinned back in a bun. She wore a floral dress and sensible shoes. She had the kind of face that had seen hard years and didn't suffer fools. She pointed at the washtub in the backyard without saying a word. Dalton rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The sheets were caked with mud. He scrubbed them on a washboard, hands raw, knuckles bleeding. The sun beat down. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Mrs. Lawson sat on the porch watching, saying nothing. It took him 4 hours. When he finished, he hung the last sheet on the line and turned to her. "Mom, I'm sorry for what I did." She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up, walked down the steps, and inspected the laundry. She ran her fingers over the fabric. She held it up to the light. "You fly like a fool, boy," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "But you fly like you mean it." She looked him in the eye. "That counts for something." She went back inside without another word. Dalton walked back to base with his ears burning and his hands blistered. The other pilots were still laughing when he returned. They called him Bing Bong for weeks. They wrote it on his locker. They shouted it across the mess hall. Dalton took it. He didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He just waited. Because in September 1942, the laughing stopped. They shipped out to the Pacific. The transport ship was a rusted freighter that smelled like diesel fuel and vomit. Dalton spent the voyage studying. While other men played cards and told stories, he sat in his bunk with the P-38 technical manual spread across his knees. He read it cover to cover. He memorized engine specs, fuel consumption rates, dive speeds, turn radii. The briefing started on the 3rd day at sea. An intelligence officer, pale and sweating in the tropical heat, stood in front of a blackboard covered in diagrams. He drew a small airplane with swept wings and a single engine. He wrote one word beneath it: 0. "Gentlemen, this is what's waiting for you," the officer explained. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a ghost. It weighed half as much as an American fighter. It had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built from lightweight duralumin fabric. It could turn on a dime and dance circles around anything the United States could put in the air. If you try to turn with a 0, you will die. It's not a maybe, it's physics. The doctrine was simple: boom and zoom, dive fast from altitude, take one shot, run away, never, ever engage in a turning fight. "The manual exists to keep you alive," the officer said. "Follow it, and you might come home." Dalton raised his hand. "What if the manual is wrong?" The room went silent. The officer stared at him. "Excuse me? What if there's a better way?" The officer's face flushed red. "The manual was written by men with more flight hours than you've been alive, Lieutenant. I suggest you trust their judgment." Dalton said nothing. But that night, alone in his bunk, he pulled out the diagrams again. He looked at the P-38 specs. He looked at the 0 specs, and he saw something the people writing the manuals had missed. Or maybe they'd seen it. Maybe they were just too scared to use it. The secret was in the nose. Wing-mounted guns had a convergence problem. The bullets had to cross at a specific range, usually 300 yards, too close or too far, and you'd miss. But the P-38's nose guns fired parallel. No convergence, no guesswork, just point and shoot. Because the engines were mounted on the twin booms, the nose of the aircraft was empty, so the engineers packed it with weapons: 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all of them clustered together, all of them pointing straight ahead. When you pulled the trigger in a P-38, the bullets flew in a solid column, like a laser beam. There was no sweet spot, there was no math. If you could see it in your gun sight, you could kill it. Dalton sat up in his bunk. This changed everything. The manual said never to go head-on with a 0. A head-on pass was suicide. The closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. You had less than 2 seconds to aim. And if you flew straight at a 0, you were flying straight at 2 cannons that could shatter your windscreen and turn your skull into red mist. The Japanese pilots loved head-on passes. They were fearless. They believed their spirit was stronger than American steel. They would play chicken until the American flinched and broke away. And the moment the American broke away, he exposed his belly. And the 0 would gut him. But the Japanese pilots were used to fighting planes with wing guns. They knew the American bullets were spread out. They knew they could slip through the gap if they timed it right. They didn't know about the P-38's nose. They didn't know that Dalton was sitting behind a buzzsaw that didn't spread out. He could fire from 800 yards out. Before the 0 pilot even had a shot, he could create a wall of metal that the enemy had to fly through. It wasn't a dogfight, it was an execution. But knowing it on paper and doing it in the sky were two different things. When the ship docked in New Guinea, Dalton requested a meeting with Colonel Blackwell. Blackwell had set up his command post in a tin-roofed shack near the airstrip. The jungle pressed in on all sides. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Blackwell sat behind a folding table, maps spread out in front of him, a dead cigar clenched between his teeth. Dalton stood at attention. "Sir, I need to talk to you about head-on passes." Blackwell looked up. His grey eyes were unreadable. "The manual forbids it, Lieutenant." "The manual was written for wing guns, sir. The P-38 is different," Dalton explained. He showed the diagrams. He ran the numbers: closing speed, fire range, convergence angles. Blackwell listened without interrupting. When Dalton finished, the colonel leaned back in his chair. "You're asking me to let you violate doctrine?" "I'm asking you to trust physics over fear, sir." Blackwell was quiet for a long time. Outside, the jungle hummed with insects. A gecko chirped from the rafters. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. "One test," Blackwell said finally. "You die, I lose a clown. You live, maybe you're a genius." He pointed at the door. "Your call, Lieutenant." Dalton saluted. "Thank you, sir." He turned to leave. Blackwell's voice stopped him. "Bridger?" "Sir?" "That stunt over the Golden Gate. You know why I didn't court-martial you?" Dalton hesitated. "No, sir. Because a pilot who can thread a bridge at 100 feet without killing himself has reflexes I can use." Blackwell picked up his cigar and studied it. "Don't make me regret it." "I won't, sir." The first test came in December. The sky over Buna was thick with clouds. The air smelled like smoke and jungle rot. Dalton was flying patrol with 3 other P-38s. Standard sweep, look for targets, engage if necessary, follow doctrine. They spotted them at 10,000 feet. Japanese Val dive bombers, 6 of them, heading for the American positions on the coast and circling above them like sharks, a flight of Zeros, 4 escort fighters, waiting. The flight leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Climbing to 15,000, we'll dive on the bombers, hit and run, stay with me." The other P-38s began to climb. Dalton turned his control yoke and pointed his nose directly at the Zero formation. "Bridger, what are you doing?" "Testing a theory." "You're going to get yourself killed." Dalton didn't answer. He shoved the throttles forward. The twin Allison engines roared. The P-38 surged ahead, picking up speed. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The Zeros saw him coming. One of them broke formation and turned to face him, head on. Every survival instinct in Dalton's body screamed at him to break away, to turn, to run. He didn't. The gap between the aircraft collapsed. 600 miles per hour of closing speed. The Zero grew from a dot to a distinct shape. Dalton could see the red circles on the wings. He could see the canopy glass. He could almost see the pilot's face. The Japanese pilot was waiting for the American to flinch, waiting for 300 yards, waiting for the convergence point. At 850 yards, Dalton squeezed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupted. The vibration of 5 heavy weapons firing at once rattled his teeth. Smoke streamed back over the canopy. A cone of tracer fire lashed out like a whip. The bullets didn't spread, they didn't wander, they flew in a solid column straight and true. The stream of lead hammered into the Zero's engine block. The effect was immediate, catastrophic. The Zero wasn't built to take punishment, it had no armor. The 50 caliber rounds punched through the cowling like it was tissue paper. The 20mm cannon shell detonated inside the engine. Metal shredded, fuel ignited. The Zero didn't spin, it didn't fall, it simply exploded. 1 second it was a terrifying war machine, the next it was a fireball tumbling through the sky. Dalton flew straight through the debris cloud. He felt the sharp clatter of metal fragments hitting his wings. Heat flashed against his windscreen. Smoke coated his canopy. He hauled back on the yoke and climbed, using the massive momentum of the heavy P-38 to zoom back up into the safety of altitude. He looked back. The Zero was gone. Just a smear of black smoke trailing down toward the jungle. Dalton's hands were shaking. His breath came in short gasps. His heart felt like it was trying to break through his ribs. It worked. The math held up. When he landed, the ground crew swarmed his plane. They were checking for damage. They found soot on the nose, scratches on the paint from debris, but not a single bullet hole. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Vernon Calhoun, stood staring at the aircraft. He was 35, a mechanic from Georgia with grease under his fingernails and 20 years of fixing planes. He'd seen pilots come back shot to pieces. He'd scraped blood out of cockpits. He'd zipped body bags. He looked at Dalton. "You flew into him?" "Yes, Sergeant." "And you came back without a scratch?" "Yes, Sergeant." Calhoun shook his head slowly. "That's impossible." "No, Sergeant, it's physics." The other pilots landed 10 minutes later. Two of them had taken hits. One had a damaged rudder. Another had holes in his wing from a Zero that had gotten on his tail during a turning fight. Dalton's plane was pristine. Colonel Blackwell was waiting in the debriefing tent. He sat at a folding table, arms crossed, face unreadable. The other pilots filed in, sweaty, exhausted, still jittery from combat. Dalton entered last. Blackwell looked at him for a long time. "Write it up," he said quietly. "Every number, every second, every detail." "Yes, sir." "Because if this works, Lieutenant, you just changed the war." The room was silent. The other pilots weren't laughing anymore. They were staring at Dalton like he'd just walked on water. Outside, the jungle hummed. The sun was setting. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. But in that tent, in that moment, the world had shifted. The clown from the Golden Gate Bridge had just rewritten the manual. The kills came quickly after that first victory. 2 more Zeros in January, then 3, then 5. By the time the rain came in February, Dalton had 12 confirmed kills painted on his nose. Each one a head-on pass, each one a Zero vaporized before it could get close enough to fight back. Vernon Calhoun painted each rising sun symbol carefully, red circles on white backgrounds, 12 of them in neat rows below the cockpit. He stood back and looked at his work. "You know what they're calling you now, Lieutenant?" "What's that, Sergeant?" "The Iceman, because you don't even blink when you pull the trigger." Dalton said nothing. He just climbed into his cockpit for another patrol. The other pilots stopped calling him Bing Bong. They started asking him questions about sight pictures, about trigger discipline, about how to beat the fear of flying straight at death. And Colonel Blackwell started getting concerned phone calls from Washington. January brought rain to New Guinea. It fell in sheets, turning the coral airstrip into a river of red mud. The jungle steamed, mold grew on boots overnight. Men slept in wet canvas tents and woke with fever. But the war didn't stop for weather. Dalton Bridger stood in front of 12 pilots in a maintenance hangar. Outside, rain hammered on the tin roof like machine gun fire. Inside, the air smelled like aviation fuel and sweat. The pilots sat on ammunition crates, flight suits dark with humidity, faces pale and drawn. They were the new replacements. Fresh from stateside, most of them had never seen combat. Most of them would be dead in a month if they flew the manual. Dalton pointed to a diagram on the blackboard behind him. "Forget everything they taught you about convergence," he said. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "In a P-38, your guns don't cross. They're parallel. You can fire from 800 yards and hit what you're aiming at." A young lieutenant raised his hand. He looked 17. "Sir, the manual says head-on passes are suicide." "The manual was written by men flying P-40S, Dalton said. "We're not flying P-40S. He drew a simple diagram, 2 aircraft approaching each other, arrows showing bullet trajectories. He marked distances, 800 yards, 600, 400, 300. The Zero pilot expects you to brake at 300 yards. That's when his wing guns become effective. But you're already killing him at 800. He's flying into a wall he can't see." The room was silent except for the rain. You fly straight at him, you fire early, you don't blink, he explodes, you go home. Dalton set down the chalk. "Any questions?" No one spoke. "Good, we fly in 1 hour." The tactics spread through the squadron like wildfire. 12 kills became 15. 15 became 18. 18 became 20. The P-38s of the 49th Fighter Group became executioners. They stopped running from Zeros. They stopped diving away. They turned into the enemy and opened fire from distances that made no sense. The Japanese didn't understand what was happening. Their veterans, pilots with 20 and 30 kills, men who had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, were vanishing. Not in dramatic dogfights, not in turning battles, they were just exploding, head-on, From impossible ranges, American intelligence intercepted radio traffic in late January. A Japanese controller, voice tight with fear, warning his pilots, "Beware the twin demon of the dawn. Do not engage the fork-tailed devil head-on." Repeat, do not engage head-on. When Dalton read the translation, he felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction, just a cold recognition that the math was working. Vernon Calhoun kept painting rising suns on the nose. 20 symbols now, 20 dead men who had made the mistake of flying straight at Dalton Bridger. But in Washington, men in suits were reading the same combat reports, and they were nervous. The cable arrived at Colonel Blackwell's desk on a Thursday morning in February. It was marked urgent, eyes only. Blackwell read it twice, jaw tightening with each word. Then he crushed his unlit cigar in his fist and called for his adjutant. "Get Bridger in here, now." Dalton arrived 15 minutes later, still in his flight suit, sweat-soaked from a morning patrol. He stood at attention. Blackwell didn't invite him to sit. "Washington is concerned about your tactics, Lieutenant." "Sir?" "They're calling it reckless. They're saying you're encouraging bad habits in the other pilots. They're saying you're creating a culture of disobedience." Blackwell's voice was tight, controlled. "They want you to return to approved doctrine." Dalton said nothing. "I told them to go to hell," Blackwell continued. "I told them you've killed 20 Japanese aircraft without taking a scratch. I told them you're winning." He paused. "They overruled me." The rain hammered on the roof. Somewhere outside, an engine coughed to life. "They're ordering me to ground you if you continue these head-on attacks. They're threatening to reassign you to a training command stateside. They're saying—" Blackwell stopped. His jaw worked. "They're saying you're more valuable alive as an example than dead as a hero." Dalton felt something cold settle in his chest. "So I'm being protected?"
You're being preserved." Blackwell's eyes were hard. "For politics, for propaganda, for everything except the one thing you're good at." "When?" "The order takes effect if you reach 38 kills using unauthorized tactics." Dalton looked at the red mud visible through the tent flap, at the rain, at the jungle pressing in on all sides. "How many do I have now, sir?" 20? "So I have 18 more." Blackwell said nothing. Dalton saluted and walked out into the rain.
The Battle of the Bismarck Sea began on March 2, 1943. Intelligence had been tracking the convoy for 3 days. 8 Japanese destroyers, 8 troop transports, nearly 7,000 soldiers packed into the holds, heading for the New Guinea coast. If they landed, the war would drag on for another year. American positions would be overrun. Men would die in jungle fighting, disease, starvation. The convoy had to be stopped, but the Japanese knew the Americans were coming. They'd assembled an umbrella of fighters, 50 Zeros, maybe more. The sky over the convoy would be a killing field. The briefing was held in the operations tent at 0400 hours. 30 pilots crowded inside. Maps covered the walls. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. A major from Bomber Command stood at the front. He pointed to the convoy's position with a wooden stick. "B-25s will go in at mast height. Skip bombing. The Zeros will try to stop us. Your job," he looked at the P-38 pilots, "is to keep them off our backs. Dive from altitude. Engage defensively only. Do not hunt. Do not get drawn into turning fights. Hit and run." Dalton raised his hand. "What if we go through them instead of around them?" The major stared at him. "Excuse me?" "The Zeros will be circling the convoy, waiting for us to dive. What if we don't dive? What if we fly straight through their screen and take them head on?" The tent went silent. "That's not the plan, Lieutenant. The plan keeps them between us and the bombers. My way clears the path." The major's face flushed red. "Colonel Blackwell, control your pilot." Blackwell stood in the corner, arms crossed. He looked at Dalton for a long moment. "You heard the Major, Bridger. Stick to the plan." "Yes, sir." But when the wheels left the Coral at dawn, Dalton wasn't thinking about the plan. He was thinking about math. The convoy appeared on the horizon at 7:30 hours. Tiny grey shapes cutting white wakes through a blue ocean. Above them, the Zeros circled like hornets protecting a hive. Dalton counted them. 30, 40, too many to count. The radio crackled. "All fighters climbing to 15,000, prepare to dive on my mark." Dalton's formation was 6 P-38s, 3 on his wing, 2 trailing, 6 aircraft against 40 Zeros. The math didn't work. Not if they played it safe. He keyed his mic. "Breaking formation, going through."
Bridger, what the hell are you, Dalton shoved the throttles to the firewall. The Allison engine screamed. The P-38 leaped forward like a horse kicked in the flanks. He pushed the nose down, diving not away from the Zeros, but toward them, directly toward them. The Japanese fighters saw him coming. 3 of them broke off from the circle and turned to meet him. Head on. They thought he would break.
They thought the American in the twin-engine bathtub would panic and turn away at the last second. They thought wrong. Dalton opened fire at 900 yards. The nose guns erupted. Smoke whipped past the canopy. Tracers lashed out in a solid stream. The lead Zero took the full column of fire directly in the engine. The cowling shredded. The propeller disintegrated. The fuel tanks, unarmored and full, detonated like a bomb. The Zero evaporated. Dalton flew through the fireball at 400 miles per hour. Debris hammered his wings. The heat flash against the windscreen was blinding. He pulled up hard, G-forces crushing him into the seat, and leveled off inside the Japanese formation. Now he was surrounded. A Zero dove on him from above. Dalton snap-rolled right, hauled back on the yoke, and came up underneath the enemy. He fired a 2-second burst. The bullets walked up the Zero's belly and into the cockpit. The Japanese plane nosed over and fell, trailing smoke. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The radio was chaos. Screaming warnings, the B-25 bombers were diving toward the convoy, skipping bombs across the water. Explosions bloomed along the sides of the transports. Ships were burning. Men were jumping into the oil-slicked sea. Dalton spotted a third Zero. This one was flying low, strafing something in the water. Dalton looked closer. American aircrew, downed pilots, swimming for their lives. The Zero was shooting them. Something cold and hard settled in Dalton's chest. He rolled, inverted, and dove. The airframe shrieked as it accelerated past 400 miles per hour. The controls stiffened. His vision narrowed. This was compressibility. The aerodynamic force that could lock the controls and drive a P-38 straight into the ocean. The experts said, if you dove too fast, you would die. Dalton rode the edge. He lined up the strafing Zero. The Japanese pilot was focused on the water, watching his bullets kick up splashes around the helpless men. He never looked up. Dalton fired from directly above. The column of lead struck the Zero from the top down. It punched through the canopy, through the pilot, through the floor, through the wing spar. The aircraft snapped in half. The pieces tumbled into the sea like broken toys. Dalton pulled out of the dive at 200 feet. The G-forces grayed his vision. Blood roared in his ears. He gasped for air, fighting the blackout, and leveled the plane just above the wave tops. 3 kills. He keyed his mic. Any P-38 still up, the path is clear. Bombers, you're through. He turned for altitude. That's when he saw it. A Zero with white tail markings and a red lightning bolt painted on the fuselage. It was climbing toward him, not running, not evading, climbing, aggressive. Dalton recognized the markings. Intelligence had briefed them. Commander Takeshi Yamada. 18 confirmed kills. Veteran of China and Pearl Harbor, one of Japan's best. The 2 aircraft turned toward each other. This wasn't like the others. This wasn't a rookie making a mistake. This was a professional, a hunter who knew what he was doing. They closed head on. Yamada knew about the P-38's nose guns. He'd read the reports. He knew the American could fire early, but he was betting on precision, on nerve, on the idea that even with perfect weapons, men could still miss. He was wrong. Dalton fired at 900 yards, a long burst, 4 seconds, the nose guns hammered, the tracers reached out like fingers of light. Yamada fired back at 600 yards, 2 20mm cannons. The muzzle flashes were bright orange. Dalton's stream hit Yamada's engine dead center. The cowling shattered. The engine block cracked, oil sprayed across the windscreen. The Zero's engine seized, propeller windmilling, smoke pouring from the cowling. But Yamada's shot had been good too. One of his 20mm shells grazed the top of Dalton's canopy. The plexiglass cracked, starred. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the top 6 inches. Shards of plastic rained down into the cockpit. One piece cut Dalton's cheek. Blood ran hot down his jaw. It was the first damage he'd taken in 23 kills. Yamada's Zero tumbled away, trailing fire. The Japanese pilot didn't bail out. He rode it down into the ocean. There was no parachute, no escape. Dalton touched his cheek. His glove came away red. Vernon Calhoun saw the blood when Dalton climbed out of the cockpit. "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant, you're hit." "It's nothing. Your canopy's cracked to hell." "I know." Calhoun walked around the P-38, inspecting. The nose guns were scorched black. The wings had debris damage. The canopy looked like someone had hit it with a hammer, but there were no bullet holes, no structural damage. 4 kills in 1 mission, Calhoun said quietly. "You're at 24 total now." Dalton didn't respond. He was staring at the blood on his glove. "He was good," Dalton said finally. "Who?" "The Japanese pilot, the one with the white tail. He knew what I was going to do. He still took the shot." Dalton looked at Calhoun. "He was better than me." "But you're alive." "Because my guns had longer range, not because I was better." Dalton wiped the blood off his face. "That's not skill. That's just equipment." Calhoun said nothing. He just handed Dalton a rag for the cut. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a massacre. All 8 transports sunk, 3 destroyers crippled, nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers drowned or killed in the water. The American losses: 5 aircraft, 3 pilots dead. Dalton Bridger had killed 4 enemy aircraft in a single mission. And in Washington, men in suits read the reports and made phone calls. The kills came faster now. 24 became 26 by the end of April. On the day Dalton broke Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories, the squadron held a celebration. Men drank contraband whiskey and told stories and slapped Dalton on the back. Dalton sat alone outside his tent, cleaning his pistol. Vernon Calhoun found him there. "You should be celebrating, Lieutenant. You just made history." "History doesn't bring back the men I killed. They were the enemy."
They were pilots, like me. Dalton looked up. His eyes were flat. "I remember their planes, Sergeant. The paint schemes, the way they moved, but I don't remember their faces. I can't even see them in my mind. What does that make me?" Calhoun was quiet for a long time. "Makes you a survivor, sir. Or a machine." 30 kills came in August, 35 by December. Each mission was the same: head-on pass, early fire, explosion. Dalton flew with mechanical precision.
He didn't waste ammunition. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He killed efficiently, professionally, without emotion. The other pilots watched him change. He stopped talking during meals. He stopped writing letters home. He stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. He would sit in his tent, staring at technical diagrams, calculating angles and distances and closure rates. Vernon Calhoun approached Colonel Blackwell one evening. Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. Lieutenant Bridger is becoming something that worries me. Explain. He's not flying like a man anymore. He's flying like a calculating machine. No fear, no hesitation, but also no humanity. Calhoun's voice was quiet. The Japanese pilots want to die for their emperor. Bridger just doesn't care if he lives. That ain't the same thing as bravery. Blackwell looked out at the airstrip where Dalton's P-38 sat, 35 rising suns painted on the nose. I know, Sergeant, but he's winning, and right now winning is all that matters. Yes, sir, but what happens when the war ends and he has to be human again? Blackwell had no answer. The cable from Washington arrived on December 20th, 1943. Blackwell called Dalton into his office 2 days before Christmas. "Sit down, Lieutenant." Dalton sat. Blackwell looked older. The grey in his hair had spread. The lines around his eyes had deepened. "Washington is ordering me to ground you." Dalton felt nothing. "When?" "When you hit 38 kills, they're saying you're too valuable to risk. You're a propaganda asset. If you die, it's a disaster for morale. Japan celebrates. The press has a field day." Blackwell's voice was bitter. "So they want you to stop fighting and start selling war bonds." "I have 3 more kills." "That's all they're giving you." Dalton stood. "Then I'd better make them count." He walked out without saluting. The 36th kill came on a morning patrol, a zero that made the mistake of flying straight. 37 came 2 days later during a strafing run that went wrong for the Japanese pilot. The 38th should have been impossible, but Dalton negotiated. He went to Blackwell's office. He stood at attention. "I want a deal, sir." "I'm listening." "Let me train new pilots in the combat zone. Supervised flights. I won't hunt. I'll just teach." Blackwell stared at him. "You're lying." "Yes, sir." "Oh, you'll get 2 more kills and claim they were defensive." "Yes, sir." Blackwell was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed. "You get caught actively hunting, I will personally court-martial you and throw you in the stockade for the rest of the war." "Understood, sir." "Permission granted. God help me." Dalton got his 38th and 39th kills during training flights in late December. Both times he claimed the Zeros had attacked first. Both times his wingmen backed up his story. Both times Blackwell looked at the reports and said nothing. The 40th kill came on January 12, 1944. It was a lone Zero, far from home, probably lost. Dalton spotted it from 10,000 feet. He could have let it go, could have turned away. He didn't. He dove. The Zero pilot saw him coming and turned to fight. They met head-on. Dalton fired at 800 yards. The Zero exploded. Debris rained into the jungle. When Dalton landed, Blackwell was waiting on the tarmac. "That's it," the colonel said. You're done." "Yes, sir." 40 confirmed kills, highest scoring American ace in history. 0 losses. Blackwell looked at the P-38, at the 40 red, rising suns painted on the nose. "The record will never be broken, you know that?" "Yes, sir." "And you're only 24 years old." Blackwell shook his head. "I don't know whether to pin a medal on you or lock you in a padded room." The Medal of Honor ceremony was held on January the 15th, 1944. Newsreel cameras, reporters, generals flown in from Hawaii. Dalton stood at attention in a pressed uniform that felt like a straitjacket. His hands were steady, his face was blank. Colonel Blackwell read the citation. It took 5 minutes. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed, pioneering tactics, exceptional bravery, service above and beyond. Blackwell pinned the medal to Dalton's chest. The cameras flashed. The crowd applauded. Dalton felt nothing. That night, alone in his tent, he tried to write a letter to Evelyn. The first in 6 months. His pen hovered over the paper. "They're sending me home. I'm done fighting. I should be happy. I'm not. I don't know what I am anymore. I killed 40 men and I can't remember most of their faces. I remember the planes, the machines, the math, but not the men. What does that make me?" He stared at the words. Then he tore the page in half and threw it in the trash. Some questions didn't have answers. 3 days later, he boarded a transport ship bound for San Francisco. The P-38, with 40 kills painted on its nose, stayed behind. Vernon Calhoun would maintain it for the next pilot. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Dalton stood at the rail and watched New Guinea disappear into the haze. He'd gone to war a clown. He was coming home a killer. And he had no idea how to be anything else. February 1944 brought Dalton Bridger back to a country that didn't recognize him. The War Bond tour started in San Francisco. They put him in a dress uniform with the Medal of Honor hanging around his neck like an anchor. They sat him at a table on a stage in a high school gymnasium. 500 people stared at him while a congressman gave a speech about heroes and sacrifice and the American way. Dalton sat with his hands folded on the table. His face was blank. His eyes were somewhere else. When the speech ended, they lined up to shake his hand. Men in suits, women in dresses, children pushed forward by proud parents. Each one wanted to touch the ace, to hear the story, to ask the question. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Lieutenant Bridger, how did it feel to kill 40 enemy pilots?" Dalton looked at him. The man had soft hands and clean fingernails. He smelled like hair tonic and cigarettes. He'd never been closer to combat than a movie theater. "I didn't kill pilots," Dalton said quietly. "I killed machines." "But there were men inside those machines." "Yes. Did you think about that when you pulled the trigger?" Dalton was silent for a long moment. Then, "Next question." The tour moved to Los Angeles, then Chicago, then New York. Always the same. Speeches, handshakes, questions he couldn't answer. Dalton played his part. He stood where they told him to stand. He smiled when they told him to smile. He signed autographs for children who wanted to be pilots when they grew up. At night, alone in hotel rooms, he stared at the ceiling and couldn't sleep. The tour ended in June. They gave him 3 weeks leave before reassignment to a training command in Arizona. 3 weeks to rest, to recover, to become human again. Dalton took a train to Wisconsin. The farm looked smaller than he remembered. The house needed paint. The barn needed repairs. His father was older, grayer, moving slower. His mother cried when she saw him. She held him for a long time without speaking. Evelyn was waiting on the porch. She was 23 years old. She had dark hair and steady eyes and hands that had worked in a Boeing factory for 2 years, riveting aluminum panels onto B-17 fuselages. She'd written him letters every week. Most of them he hadn't read. She looked at him and knew immediately that something was broken. "Dale." "Evie." They stood 3 feet apart. The distance felt like miles. "You didn't write back," she said quietly. "I know. I thought you were dead." "I wasn't dead, I was just—" He stopped. He didn't have words for what he'd been. She stepped forward and took his hand. Her fingers were warm. His were cold. "You're home now," she said. "That's all that matters." They were married on July 15th, 1944. It was a small ceremony, 20 people in a white church with wooden pews. Dalton wore his dress uniform. Evelyn wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself. His father walked her down the aisle. His mother cried again. The minister read from Corinthians, "Love is patient, love is kind." The words sounded like they were coming from underwater. Dalton said his vows. His voice was steady. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Dalton leaned forward and pressed his lips to Evelyn's. It felt like going through the motions, like following a checklist. She pulled back and looked at him, really looked at him. And he saw the question in her eyes. "Where did you go?" He had no answer. The reception was in the church basement. Cake and coffee. People congratulated them, shook his hand, told him he was a hero, told him how proud they were, told him the war would be over soon, and he could get back to normal life. Normal life. Dalton didn't know what that meant anymore. The months that followed were the longest of Dalton's life. He worked the farm. He fixed fences. He plowed fields. He milked cows. He did all the things he'd done as a boy, but his hands remembered different work. They remembered control yokes and trigger buttons and the vibration of guns firing. He woke at 0400 every morning out of habit. He couldn't sleep past sunrise. He stood in the barn and felt the walls closing in. He walked to the wood line and stared at the sky and felt empty. Evelyn watched him getting quieter, more distant. She tried to pull him back. She made his favorite meals. She talked about the future, about children they might have, about the house they would build. Dalton listened and nodded and felt like he was watching his life happen to someone else. The nightmares started in September. He would wake at 0300, drenched in sweat, hearing the roar of engines that weren't there. Sometimes he dreamed he was back in the cockpit lining up another zero. Sometimes he dreamed the 01. Sometimes he dreamed he pulled the trigger and nothing happened, and the Japanese pilot smiled at him through the windscreen as they collided. Evelyn would find him standing in the barn at dawn, staring at nothing. "Talk to me," she'd say. He couldn't. The words were locked behind a wall he'd built to survive 40 kills. Opening that wall meant feeling everything he'd refused to feel in the cockpit. The fear, the guilt, the knowledge that he'd killed 40 men who had mothers and wives and children who would never see them again. It was easier to feel nothing. One morning in October, he was chopping wood behind the barn. The axe came down wrong. It glanced off the log and buried itself in his boot, missing his toes by an inch. He stood there staring at the axe, waiting to feel something. Fear, relief, anything. Nothing came. That's when he knew he was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed by coming home. Evelyn found him sitting on the porch that evening. "You're not here," she said quietly. "Not really." "I'm trying." "I know," she sat beside him. "But you left part of yourself in that cockpit, and I don't know how to bring it back." Neither did he. In October, a letter arrived from Colonel Blackwell. "Lieutenant Bridger, war's winding down. Germany will fall by spring. Japan by summer, if the rumors about the new weapon are true. You won. The zeros are grounded. The Pacific belongs to us now. Your record stands 40-0. No one will ever touch it. Rest easy, son. You've earned it." Colonel Augustus Blackwell Dalton read the letter 3 times. Then he crumpled it and threw it in the fire. It didn't feel like winning. Winter came. Snow covered the fields. Dalton chopped wood and hauled water and felt himself disappearing one day at a time. He was 24 years old. He'd killed 40 men. And now he was supposed to spend the rest of his life pretending it never happened. The letter from Lockheed arrived in April 1945. It was typed on official stationery, addressed to Lieutenant Dalton Bridger, Medal of Honor recipient. The opening paragraph talked about patriotic duty and the future of American aviation. The second paragraph got to the point. Lockheed was developing the P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet fighter, faster than anything that had ever flown. They needed test pilots, the best pilots, pilots who could handle experimental aircraft and survive when things went wrong. They wanted him. Dalton read the letter 4 times. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Evelyn found him holding the letter. "No," she said immediately. "It's not combat, it's testing, it's science. You promised me you were done flying. I promised I was done fighting. This is different."
How is it different? Because no one's shooting at me. She stared at him. Her eyes were wet. "You're going to leave me. I'm going to California for a few months. Then I'll come back." "You're lying," her voice cracked. "You need this more than you need me." Dalton wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to say that he loved her more than flying, that he would stay, that the farm and the quiet life would be enough, but he couldn't lie to her. "I'm empty here, Evie. I don't know who I am anymore. Maybe if I do this, I can figure it out." She turned away. "Go then, but don't expect me to wait forever." "I'll be back by summer." "That's what you said when you went to the Pacific." She walked out. Dalton sat alone with the letter. He shipped out to Burbank 2 weeks later. The Lockheed facility sprawled across acres of concrete. Hangars the size of football fields, machine shops, wind tunnels, and sitting on the tarmac like a silver bullet, the P-80 Shooting Star. It was beautiful in a way the P-38 had never been. Sleek, simple, no propellers, no twin booms, just a smooth fuselage with a jet engine buried in the belly and wings swept back like a knife. The chief engineer was a man named Hoffman, 45 years old, thick glasses, cigarette always burning. He walked Dalton around the aircraft. "She'll do 500 miles per hour in level flight, faster in a dive. The jet engine is temperamental, fuel consumption is terrible, and the systems are all experimental." Hoffman tapped the fuselage. "We've had 3 flameouts during ground tests. Primary fuel pump is unreliable. Can you fix it?" "Eventually. Right now we're just trying to understand it." Dalton ran his hand along the wing. The metal was cold and smooth. "When do I fly her?" "Tomorrow, if you're ready." "I'm ready." The first 4 test flights went perfectly. Dalton strapped into the cockpit. The canopy came down. The engine spooled up with a banshee scream that rattled his bones. No pistons, no vibration, just pure thrust. Takeoff was smooth. Climbing was effortless. The P-80 handled like a dream. Responsive, quick, light on the controls. Dalton pushed it through rolls and loops and high G turns. The airframe handled everything he threw at it. When he landed, he was grinning for the first time in months. Hoffman met him on the tarmac. "How was it?" "She's perfect." "She's dangerous, don't forget that." But Dalton had already forgotten. For those 40 minutes in the air, he'd felt alive again. He'd felt like himself. The 5th test flight was scheduled for August 2nd. Dalton climbed to 15,000 feet. He put the P-80 through its paces. Steep turns, stalls, high-speed runs, everything felt good. Then, at 12,000 feet, the engine hiccuped. A momentary loss of power, just a fraction of a second. Then it smoothed out. Dalton keyed his radio. "Tower, I had a slight surge at 12,000. "Copy, return to base." He landed without incident. Hoffman was waiting, face tight. "Fuel pump," the engineer said. "Same problem we've been seeing. We need to replace the entire assembly, 2 weeks minimum." "I can fly around it. I know the tolerances now." "Lieutenant, that pump is a time bomb. 1 more flight and it could fail completely. Then fix it and we'll fly again in 2 weeks." That's the plan, but Dalton couldn't wait 2 weeks, not when he'd finally found something that made him feel whole. He convinced Hoffman to let him do 1 more test flight, just 1. Quick flight around the pattern, check the systems, then they'd pull the aircraft and do the full pump replacement. Hoffman agreed reluctantly. The flight was scheduled for August 6th. The morning was clear. California sky stretched blue and endless. Dalton arrived at the airfield at 0800 hours.
He did his pre-flight inspection, checked the fuel, checked the controls. Everything looked good. The phone in the operations office rang. It was Evelyn. "Dale, I need to talk to you. I'm about to fly. It's important. Can it wait until this evening?" There was a long pause. "I'm pregnant." Dalton's hand tightened on the phone. The world seemed to tilt. "What?" "2 months. I wasn't sure. Now I am." Her voice was quiet. "Come home this weekend, please." "I will, I promise."
"Lee, you always say that." "This time I mean it. 1 more flight, then I'm done. Then I come home and we figure this out together." "Okay." She didn't sound like she believed him. "I love you." "I love you too." He hung up. He was going to be a father. Hoffman found him standing by the aircraft. "You all right, Lieutenant?" "Fine. Let's get this done." At 0900 hours, Dalton climbed into the cockpit for the last time. The engine started perfectly. The instruments looked good.
Tower cleared him for takeoff. Dalton advanced the throttle. The P-80 rolled down the runway and lifted smoothly into the California sky, climbing through 500 feet. Airspeed 180 knots. Everything nominal. Then the primary fuel pump failed. The engine didn't sputter. It didn't cough. It just stopped. The roar cut off like someone had thrown a switch. Sudden silence except for the whistle of wind. The P-80 became a 7-ton glider. Dalton's hands moved automatically. He keyed the radio. "Tower, I've lost power. Engines out. I'm dead stick over Burbank." "Eject, eject. You're over residential." Dalton looked down. Houses, streets, backyards. He could see children playing, a woman hanging laundry, a man washing his car, all of them directly below him. His hand moved to the canopy jettison handle. 1 pull. The canopy would blow off. Then he'd pull the seat release. The parachute would deploy. He would float down safe. And the P-80 would cartwheel into the neighborhood and kill everyone below. Dalton's hand stopped. He thought about Mrs. Beatrice Lawson in Oakland. Her laundry scattered in the dirt. The look on her face when he'd apologized. He thought about Evelyn, pregnant, waiting for him to come home. He thought about 40 zeros exploding, 40 men who never had a choice. These people had a choice. His choice. Dalton pushed the stick forward and aimed for an empty industrial lot 3 blocks away. The P-80 glided, losing altitude, 200 feet, 100. The houses rushed past below, so close he could see faces in windows looking up. Almost there. The lot was ahead. Empty concrete. No people. He could make it. 50 feet. The P-80 dropped like a stone. Dalton pulled back, trying to stretch the glide. The nose came up. The tail dropped. He cleared the last house by 10 feet. Then the aircraft fell short. It hit the ground 50 yards from the lot. The landing gear collapsed. The fuselage slammed into concrete. Metal shrieked. The fuel tanks ruptured. Explosion. Fireball. Silence. At that exact moment, 8,000 miles away, a B-29 superfortress called the Enola Gay opened its bomb bay doors over the city of Hiroshima. The atomic bomb fell. The world changed. The headlines the next morning screamed in letters 3 inches tall, "Atomic bomb destroys Japanese city, war effectively over." Page 14, bottom right corner, a small article, "Test pilot killed in California crash. Lieutenant Dalton Bridger, 24, Medal of Honor recipient, dies when experimental jet loses power. Eyewitnesses report pilot stayed with aircraft to avoid hitting homes. Colonel Augustus Blackwell flew from the Pacific to attend the funeral." It was held in the same white church where Dalton and Evelyn had been married 13 months earlier. The same wooden pews, the same minister, but this time the church was full. Pilots, mechanics, reporters, townspeople who'd never met him but knew his name. Evelyn sat in the front row, 2 months pregnant, wearing black. Her face was dry. She'd cried herself empty 3 days ago. Blackwell gave the eulogy. Lieutenant Dalton Bridger broke every rule in the manual. He flew head-on when we told him to run. He stayed in the fight when we told him to go home. He climbed into that jet when he should have stayed on the ground. Blackwell's voice was rough. And in the end, he stayed with his aircraft when he could have saved himself, because that's who he was, a pilot who protected people even when it killed him. Vernon Calhoun stood in the back of the church. He was 50 now, greyer, slower. He'd maintained Dalton's P-38 for another year after the ace left, trained new mechanics on it, told them the story of the pilot who flew 40 missions and never took a scratch. When they asked him what happened to that plane, Vernon always said the same thing. Still flying, somewhere. At the graveside, Vernon saluted the flag-draped casket one last time. Then he walked to his truck and drove back east. There was still work to do, there were still planes to fix, but none of them would ever be Dalton's. When the service ended, they buried him in the town cemetery. 21-gun salute, taps played on a bugle, the flag folded and presented to Evelyn. She held it in her lap and stared at nothing. That evening, alone in the farmhouse, she opened the letter Dalton had left in his footlocker. The one dated August 5th. The one marked, "In case something happens. Evie, if you're reading this, the jet got me. Don't be angry. I spent 40 fights proving the impossible was possible. I flew a plane nobody wanted and made it into a weapon nobody could stop. I broke the manual, and I was right. That's more than most men get. Tell our child, if we have one, that some rules exist to be broken." The experts said head-on was suicide. I flew head-on 40 times and walked away every time. The manual was wrong. I was right. That's legacy enough. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you needed me to be. Dale Evelyn folded the letter. She placed her hand on her stomach. "Your father saved those people," she whispered. "That's who he was." She never remarried. 20 years later, in 1965, Evelyn stood in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. She was 43 years old. Her son stood beside her, 19 years old, tall in his Air Force cadet uniform. They stood in front of a P-38 with 40 red rising suns painted on its nose. "That was his plane?" her son asked. "That was his plane. Did you ever fly with him?" "Once, before the war. He took me up in a Piper Cub. Scared me half to death," she smiled. "He laughed the whole time." Her son looked at the photograph taped to the instrument panel. A young woman in a white dress, his mother. "Why did you keep waiting for him? In the photo," Evelyn touched the glass. "Because he asked me to, and I never break a promise." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then her son saluted the aircraft. And Evelyn whispered, "You can rest now, Dale. I kept watch long enough." And in 1968, her son graduated from the Air Force Academy. He became a test pilot. He flew experimental aircraft. He broke speed records. When reporters asked him why, he always gave the same answer. "My father taught me that being careful doesn't make you safe. Being good does." The records stand. Dalton Bridger, 40 aerial victories, 0 losses, highest scoring American ace in history. His head-on tactic became standard doctrine for nose-gun-equipped fighters. It was taught at every flight school, used in Korea, used in the early jets, used until missiles made guns obsolete. The P-38 Lightning was retired in 1949, melted down for scrap. 3 flyable examples remain in museums, but in one of those museums, in a climate-controlled hangar, sits the P-38 with 40 red rising suns painted on the nose. And taped to the instrument panel, faded and yellow with age, is a photograph. A young woman in a white dress, dark hair, steady eyes. Evelyn, still waiting, still keeping watch. The manual said it was impossible. Dalton proved it was just physics, and sometimes, late at night, when the museum is closed and the lights are off, the old mechanics swear they can hear it. The distant sound of twin Allison engines, climbing, always climbing, into a sky that never ends.